In the summer of 1971, social psychologist Philip Zimbardo began an experiment in Palo Alto, California that would revolutionize our understanding of freedom. America had that same year banned cigarette ads from television, was still deeply entrenched in the Vietnam War abroad and protests at home, and President Nixon struggled in relating to the needs of the newly organized Black Caucus. In this setting, Zimbardo selected 24 college-aged men of Palo Alto, California, not all college students, to volunteer for an experiment to understand what he thought to be the psychology of the imprisoned. They had been screened and determined to be psychologically stable and healthy, and were randomly assigned as either prisoner or guard. The assigned guards knew that the assigned prisoners had actually done nothing wrong, and the prisoners knew that the guards were simply other college-age students. The assigned guards were notified a day earlier to help them put the finishing touches on the mock prison in the basement of the Stanford psychology building. The assigned prisoners were arrested the following Sunday morning for randomly either burglary or armed robbery. They were arrested with the assistance of the Palo Alto Police Department, the real police department, and assigned randomly into cells in groups of 3. Everyone involved, prisoner and guard alike, was contracted to be paid $15 a day for the study, and the simulation was expected to last 2 weeks. They were all told at the beginning that they could leave at any time. The participants adapted to their assigned roles well beyond even what Dr. Zimbardo himself explained or expected. Those assigned as officers displayed their authority to maintain prison order. It seemed that those assigned as guards fell into one of 3 categories: tough but fair guards who followed the prison rules, good guys who did little favors for the prisoners but never really punished them, and finally, about a third of the assigned guards were hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in their forms of prisoner humiliation. This group of those role-playing guards appeared to thoroughly enjoy the power that they wielded, yet none of the tests or interviews were able to predict this behavior. The only link, actually, between personality and prison behavior in that experience was finding that prisoners with a high degree of authoritarianism actually endured this prison environment longer than did other prisoners. Although the assigned guards were told that they could not harm those who were serving as prisoners, the assigned guards developed creative ways in which to punish them. Push-ups and irrational counting off, dragging their only blanket through underbrush so that they had to spend mindless hours picking out burrs if they chose to use it. They even used a fire extinguisher against particularly bad inmates and subjected some of the assigned prisoners to further torture. Those assigned to be prisoners wore smocks, were stripped naked at times, were forced to wear bags over their heads and subjected to humiliation and sleep deprivation. Even going to the toilet became a privilege, which a guard could grant or deny at his whim. Rebellions on behalf of the prisoners were staged and an escape attempted, but many of the prisoners developed passive attitudes and would not join forces with the other assigned inmates for things such as hunger strikes or negotiations. Some young men in the role of prisoners even inflicted punishment on other prisoners at the request of the guards. In order to break the solidarity among the prisoners, one of the 3 cells the guards decided was to be designated a privileged cell. The 3 good prisoners were given special privileges. They got their uniforms back and were allowed to wash and brush their teeth. Others were not. Privileged prisoners also got to eat special food in the presence of the other prisoners who had temporarily lost the privilege of eating. The guards then arbitrarily took some of these good prisoners and put them into the bad cells, and took some of the bad prisoners and put them into the good cells. Some of the prisoners who were the ringleaders then thought, of course, that the prisoners from the privileged cell must be informants. And suddenly, the prisoners became distrustful of one another. Similar tactics are actually used by real guards in real prisons to break prisoner alliances. By dividing and conquering in this way, guards promote aggression among inmates, thereby deflecting it from themselves. The experiment even affected Dr. Zimbardo himself, the researcher, who, in his capacity as prison superintendent, lost sight of his role as psychologist and permitted the abuse to continue as though it were a real prison. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, one prisoner began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. And in spite of all this, they had already begun thinking so much like prison authorities that the researchers thought that he was trying to con them, to fool them into releasing him. The 4th day included a previously scheduled visiting hour for parents and friends. Worried that when the parents saw the state of the jail, they might insist on taking their sons home, guards and researchers manipulated both the situation and the visitors by making the prison environment seem more pleasant and benign. They washed, shaved, and groomed the prisoners, had them clean and polish their cells, fed them a big dinner, played music on the intercom, and even had an attractive former Stanford cheerleader greet the visitors at the registration desk. When the dozen or so visitors came, full of good humor at what seemed to be a novel, fun experience, this systematically brought the prisoners' behavior under control. The visitors were actually made to register, to wait half an hour. Were told that only 2 visitors could see any one prisoner. They were limited to only 10 minutes of visiting time and had to be under surveillance of a guard during the visit. Of course, parents complained about these arbitrary rules, but remarkably, each one complied. Some of the parents were upset when they saw how fatigued and distressed their sons were, but their reactions were not to take them home. The circumstances were indeed too powerful. They began instead to work within the designated system to appeal privately to the superintendent to try and make the conditions better for their son. When one mother said she'd never seen her son look so bad, Zimbardo responded by shifting the blame from the situation to her son. "What's the matter with your boy? Doesn't he sleep well?" he asked. Then he asked the father, "Don't you think your boy can handle this?" The father responded, "Of course he can. He's a tough kid, a leader." Turned to the mother and said, "Come on, honey, we've wasted enough time already," and told the researcher, "We'll see you the next visiting time." It was an experiment, a simulation. They all knew it, everyone involved. The next major event was a rumored mass escape plot. One of the guards overheard the prisoners talking about an escape that would take place immediately after visiting hours. The rumor was that the prisoner who had been released the night before, that one who was having a crying fit, was going to round up a bunch of his friends and break into free the prisoners. Instead of acting like social psychologists and recording the pattern of rumor transmissions and preparing themselves to observe the impending escape, the researchers reacted with concern over the security of their prison. They held a strategy session to plan how to foil the rumored escape. The rumor of the prison break, though, turned out to be just a rumor. But after spending an entire day planning to foil the escape, begging the real police department in Palo Alto for assistance, dismantling most of the prison and moving the prisoners to a different location, someone was going to have to pay for this. All discipline escalated. The following day, more lines were blurred when between reality and simulation. A priest had been scheduled to visit and interview each of the inmates separately. Everyone introduced themselves as a number when they met the priest. The chaplain asked them what they were doing to get out of the situation and whether or not they were working with a lawyer. Since, of course, no one was, it was a simulation. This multiplied the anxiety of the inmates even more. The only prisoner who did not want to speak to the priest was actually a prisoner who was feeling sick. He'd refused to eat and wanted to see a doctor rather than a priest. Eventually, he was persuaded to come out of his cell and talk to the priest and superintendent so that they could see what kind of a doctor he needed. While talking to them, he broke down and began to cry hysterically. They took the chain off of his foot. Previously, they had placed chains on each inmate's ankle to remind them of their position of incarceration even as they slept. It was hooked to nothing, just around their ankle. They took the nylon cap off of his head, which everyone was required to wear to increase anonymity since they could not shave their heads. And he was told to rest in a room that was adjacent to the prison yard while arrangements were being made to get him some food and to take him to see a doctor. One of the guards lined up all of the other prisoners in the meantime so that they could chant aloud. Prisoner number 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner number 819 did, my cell is a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer. And they shouted this over and over and over again. Through his tears, the prisoner said he could not leave because the others had labeled him a bad prisoner. Even though he was feeling sick, he wanted to go back and prove that he was not a bad prisoner. Zimbardo responded with, "Listen, you are not number 819. You are," and said his name. "And my name is Dr. Zimbardo. I'm a psychologist, not a prison superintendent. And this is not a real prison. It's an experiment. And those are students, not prisoners, just like you. Let's go." Suddenly, he stopped crying, looked up at the researcher like a small child awakened from a nightmare, and replied, "Okay, let's go." The following day, a mock parole board had also been created as part of the experiment. All prisoners who thought they had grounds for being paroled were chained together individually, brought before the parole board. The board was composed mainly of people who were strangers to the prisoners, departmental secretaries and graduate students, and was headed by a top prison consultant. When prisoners were asked whether they would forfeit the money that they had earned up to that time if they were to be paroled, most said yes. So to get out of the situation right then, they would forfeit all the money that they'd earned up to that point. But when the hearings ended by telling prisoners to go back to their cells while their requests were considered, every prisoner obeyed. Even though they could have obtained exactly the same result simply by quitting the experiment at that very moment. The entire experiment was abruptly stopped after only 6 days. What finally caused them to call it off? The main two reasons cited by Zimbardo are that first, the guards had begun to escalate their abuse of prisoners in the middle of the night when they thought that none of the researchers were watching. Their boredom had driven them to ever more pornographic and degrading abuse of the prisoners. Secondly, a recent Stanford PhD brought in to conduct interviews with the guards and the prisoners strongly objected when she saw the prisoners being marched on a toilet run with bags over their heads, legs chained together, hands on one another's shoulders, naked. Filled with outrage, she said, "It is terrible what you are doing to these boys." Out of 50 or more outsiders who had seen the prison, she was the only one who ever questioned its morality. Once she encountered the power of the situation, however, it became very clear that the study should be ended. Now, I've given you just an outline of the happenings of the Stanford experiment, and I highly recommend reading Zimbardo's latest book. It's called The Lucifer Effect. There's actually a whole website on the Lucifer Effect. He goes deeper into the relationships between what he learned in the Stanford experiment and the more recent atrocities in Abu Ghraib prison, as well as some parallels of dehumanization that he sees in the prison that are similar to what led to the genocide in Rwanda. Now, what does this experiment have to do with us in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Midtown Tulsa, Oklahoma? Zimbardo's research suggests that evil is not a character trait. Evil is not a disposition. Perfectly normal, otherwise moral human beings can behave in ways in which they never believed that they were capable. We have been looking at freedom this month. And today I want to look at the ways in which we may not be as free as we believe ourselves to be. The power centers of our culture, law and medicine and religion, were all founded on the idea of a dispositional definition of evil. A definition in which the culpability or the illness or the evil are located in the character of the individual. But it's not that simple. As a culture, we're moving away in our understanding of the relationship of culpability, illness, and sin, away from the individual to a broader understanding of the relationship between the individual and the systems of which that individual is a part. It's easier to see it in medicine as an example. For some reason, we have less investment there. In progressive healthcare, we do not isolate the individual from his or her environment when we look at the cause of illness, for example. If a child comes into an office with lung problems, in addition to looking at the biology and chemistry of the child, we also ask whether or not there are smokers in the house, or if there's any other external circumstance. Do you have mold or live next to a coal plant? You get the picture. We're looking at the big picture. In diagnosing illness, it would be irresponsible for us to ignore the influences of the environment. Just as in medicine, external circumstances of which we are a part also play a huge role in whether or not we commit an unlawful act. We are making strides in this country regarding moving away from looking at the solo actor in the legal system as well. We're moving towards drug courts and mental health courts that take into account situational influences such as addiction and mental illness. But we still have a long way to go. Just as in law and as in medicine, our moral choices are also subject to external forces. In our free religious tradition, we have moved away from the concept of blaming the sinner. It used to be that someone was immoral because they were born a sinner and therefore would be punished accordingly by God unless they said some magic word. We've moved to a concept of individual people making bad choices. Love the sinner, hate the sin. In that model, everyone is equally as free to make choices about their own moral behavior. But the next step, I believe, in an understanding of holistic morality or a progressive interpretation of morality is to recognize the interrelated connection of the systems of which we are a part and the behaviors that we exhibit. We are not completely free to make what some would consider moral choices, because we're not on a level playing field. Our circumstances contribute to and shape our opportunities to make moral choices. If you're surrounded by people who foster connection, who value diversity, and hold you accountable to the moral standards which you profess, you are more likely to behave morally. Looking at the environment is important. Case in point, the United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other country in the world. Oklahoma incarcerates more women than any other state. Therefore, Oklahoma incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. Follow me so far? So if the environment doesn't matter, then we should assume that Oklahoma is made up of the most dangerous and evil women in the world. Or another example, there are more African Americans in jail or on parole than there were slaves preceding the Civil War. If we choose to ignore the influences of external systems like the number of people in poverty who are of color or the arrest rates of minorities for those same behaviors, then we can conclude, and a lot of people do, that there is something wrong with those people. If you are part of a system that promotes anonymous behaviors instead of accountability and transparency, that fosters dehumanization instead of connection to difference, then you are more likely to behave immorally. Zimbardo suggests that we are most likely to overestimate the freedom of the individual to choose their own behavior and underestimate the influence of circumstance. We focus too much, she says, on motives, traits, genes, and personal pathologies, and ignore the situation or the circumstantial influences on individual behavior. I would argue that in our current situation, we can even be seen wielding freedom as a weapon when we assume no external factors and that everyone has an equal shot. We're wielding freedom as a weapon. We cannot say, I chose to go to law school and he chose to be a heroin addict. He should have gone to law school. We would wield freedom as a weapon when we do not treat the mentally ill and then we incarcerate them saying that they should have chosen differently. We wield freedom as a weapon when we ignore the influence of addiction and then incarcerate them, saying they should have made better choices. We wield freedom as a weapon when we give the poor a horrible education and then say, oh, it's too bad that they didn't choose to go to college. It's not that simple. Those people assigned to be prison guards in the Stanford experiment probably didn't go around making people suffer prior to those very specific circumstances. They were otherwise normal and moral people who grew up with lots of opportunity and had never been in trouble before. If you asked them before this experiment, if we put you in a position of power, would you abuse, disrespect, and torture those whom you have power over? They would respond no. And if you asked those assigned as prisoners whether or not they would willingly give up their freedom and personal power, be humiliated and tortured for $15 a day, all of them, my guess, would have said no. For the most part, and this is the point, the world is not divided into good or evil people. The world is divided into groups of people who are in situations that create more opportunity to do things that we would consider to be good, and those who are in situations that create more opportunities to do things that we would consider to be evil. Our efforts to improve our systems, to combat the Lucifer effect, are efforts that provide more and more conditions of opportunity to do things that we would consider to be good, so that more and more people will make their next decision a good one, a moral and a legal one, so that the systems of which they are a part influence these individuals positively. Now, what does that mean? It means improving the schools for everyone, leveling the playing field as much as possible. It means providing mental health and drug treatment for everyone who needs it. It means making sure that no one goes hungry, that people have their basic needs met. And it means recognizing that we are not all starting from the same place, and that the way to increase freedom is to increase the number of healthy choices a person can make. Choices that are good for them, for the community, and that connect them to a future that we would all want to live in. It means finding a way to support people by creating opportunities for them to succeed. So lastly, what if we were the ones with the power? What if we were the ones with the power? How can we be sure that we will resist situational, external influences that push us to go against our own value system? What if you had been randomly assigned as a guard? Dr. Zimbardo suggests from his research the way to resist the Lucifer effect, to tell that devil to get thee away from thee, Satan, is do not maintain an illusion of personal invulnerability. If it can happen to them, it can happen to you. To be ready at any moment to say the three most difficult phrases in the world. I was wrong, I made a mistake, and I've changed my mind. Cut bait, accept immediate loss of money or face, etc., that could lead to a bigger long-term loss. People get invested. It's like an ego investment, which leads to the next one. Separate your ego from your actions. That is independent from the occasional failure, so that you can rebound and make the next right choice. Separate the messenger from the message in your mind. What decision would increase freedom, he asks. Never allow yourself to be cut off emotionally from your familiar and trusted reference groups of family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, I would add, church. Try out your choices in your community. Trust your intention, your gut feelings when you sense you're becoming a target of influence, he says. And lastly, recognize that rules are abstractions for controlling behavior and eliciting compliance and conformity. Challenge them when necessary. Ask who made this rule, what purpose does it serve, who maintains it, does it make sense in the specific situation, what would happen if you violated it? Insist that the rule be made explicit so that it cannot be modified and altered over time to suit the influence agent. The participants in the Stanford experiment could have left at any time. They could have returned to their suburban neighborhood and left that prison behind at any time. So who is responsible for what happened at Stanford in 1971? Everyone involved. The researcher, the prisoner, the guard. When we take responsibility not only for our individual behavior, but also for the actions and situations of the systems of which we are a part, then and only then will we be able to increase our freedoms as well as our neighbors. May it be so. Amen.